That's a great question, and I think there's a lot of nuggets in this answer that I'm going to give. That just go like this when just say just put your hand up when you say slow down or stop. All right, for any of you guys. So if you guys want to interject on something, but I have a pretty interesting story to tell about the history of sports performance in the U.S. where it started, where it came from, and yeah, I would say I was one of the guys that helped to kick it off, along with Vern Gambetta, and along with a guy by the name of Randy Smythe. These guys were doing these types of things, in the late '80s, early '90s, and I kind of jumped in with those guys, early on. I'm probably the youngest of those guys. I think Vern is close to 70 now, or in his late 60s. But yeah, it started exactly like that. When I went to Europe and Finland and learned all these techniques and brought it back. And I didn't really realize the systems that were being addressed. I thought it was the nervous system, muscular system, with the medicine ball training and the movement skill training and all the dynamic skipping movements and all the things we do for speed development. And we knew strength was important. We didn't know how important back then in the late 80s, early 90s. But, it was part of our program, but it wasn't necessarily the top priority in the program. The top priority in the program was movement skill training. Always has been, always will be. And we always got results. But we didn't really understand why. We thought it was the nervous system changing and the muscles, becoming more explosive and whatnot. That's what we thought. But as time went on, the evolution of this, you were right. All gyms were like Planet Fitnesses are today. All gyms were a sea of Nautilus equipment, a sea of, free weights and all the Arnold Schwarzenegger and the bodybuilders. And I felt like we helped lead that crusade to change that with our first facility back in '93 and what we were doing, and then so on and so forth. But as time went on, we were challenged. Our methodology was challenged, and where it was challenged was by a guy by the name of Charles Poliquin, who passed away. God rest, his soul rest in peace. Knowledgeable guy. We had Poliquin come into the Parisi Speed School. We hired him and paid him a consulting fee just to come in and lecture to our guys. And that concept, a lot of his writings were really about strength. And he kind of developed this camp, and I'm kind of letting you know where this all went, because my background originated in track and field, and the Parisi philosophy has always been about movement skill training, sprint training, sprint drills and skills development, plyos, and strength training, where he created a camp where it was all strength training. Like, you just get stronger, you get faster, end of story, to a point where by 2000, guys were kind of blogging about speed training is a fraud, just get stronger and you'll get faster. It was being said that, and this was online, and all these, so-called competitors were saying that you don't even need to run to get faster. Just lift, just get stronger, right? Now, to a degree, that might hold some truth with some athletes, but that's kind of risky from an injury standpoint and whatnot. But that was what happened throughout the 90s. I mean, that was the, I think there was two camps. There was always multiple camps in this industry, right? There's always different camps. But that was definitely a camp that was gaining traction. We did put more emphasis on strength training when more of that information came out. And how that information got really popular in 2000 was a study by Peter Weyand. Peter Weyand is a PhD researcher, biomechanist, specialist in speed. And he was at Harvard University at the time, and he ran a study, and he compared world-class sprinters to amateur sprinters. And he researched them on a treadmill, a $250,000 treadmill they have at Harvard, and with a force plate measurement device inside the treadmill. And he looked at, why do world-class sprinters run so fast compared to amateur sprinters or the average Joe? And what the research showed, that first study, what the research showed is they put a huge amount of force into the ground on each stride, upwards of 5 times their body weight of peak force. So if you're a 200-pound sprinter, you know, these guys are putting almost 1,000 pounds of force into the ground in less than a tenth of a second. So let's think about that for a second. World-class sprinters actually go 0.8 seconds, so 800ths of a second, generating upward almost 900 to 1,000 pounds of force. Like, you can't get, that's hard to do. Like, you know, you can't get any exercise really to mimic that. But it was about strength. You know, they said, wow. And they realized that, hey, what makes people really fast is if they're really strong for their body weight, you know, relative to their body weight, they're going to run real fast. So a lot of people took that research and put blinders on and ran with that and said, you know, it's all about getting stronger. Get stronger, you get faster. Yes, to a degree. Now and that's where a lot of the battle started. So this was perking up throughout the 90s. And in 2000, this study came out, and then the camps were divided even more. Now, I even had former coaches that worked for me where they were like, you know, we don't even believe in running. And they were like, went down this camp, you know, 1 or 2 former coaches, which I'll remain nameless on this call. But it was really interesting. They went really down this other road. And I never really bought into that, like, obviously. But I knew it was important. And, you know, we stepped up our strength training a little bit at that time because, you know, the research showed it was important. But we didn't think it was the most important thing. So let's accelerate this. 2010 comes along. Peter Wayan now is at SMU, and he does another study. And he says, okay, let's look at this. And in the first study, by the way, the research showed that they not only put greater force into the ground, their stride frequency was the same as amateur sprinters. So their recovery time was the same. What the difference was, and the 2010 study validated this, was not just the amount of force, but the 2010 study in 2000 SMU was how fast they put the force in there. So it was the rate of force development along with the amount of force. So now that started to say, okay, it's not just about the amount of force, but the rate of force. Now, move it to 4 years later, they do a follow-up study, and Dr. Ken Clark was a PhD student at the time at SMU, and they started to look at this force signature of each ground contact. So 2010, they realized, hey, it's relative body strength, it's how much, you know, force can be put into the ground per your body weight. Huge breakthrough. They realized that even the recovery time, or what they call the leg swing time, was the same for amateur sprinters compared to world-class sprinters, or the average Joes, was the same. Now, and they're like, wow. So 2010, they say, hey, it's also really more about, you know, how fast the force is put into the ground. Then 2014, they come out with a real breakthrough study, and they looked at force signature. So they actually graphed the signature, and I had this, and they noticed that it wasn't just about the amount of force or how fast the force was put into the ground, but the expression of force, how the force was expressed. So that force signature. So they looked at average Joes, amateur athletes, compared to world-class sprinters, running at the same speeds on a force plate treadmill, running at the same exact speeds, that the force signature for world-class sprinters was different. Like how they express force. And how they express force was that when their foot hit the ground, they had an initial spike in force production. They would still produce similar amounts of force because they were running at similar speeds relative to body weight. If you look at everything being equal, with the world-class sprinters, force production might have been a slight bit higher, but insignificant because they were running the same speeds. But the expression of the force, where the initial ground contact force signature was different in the first half of that contact compared to the amateur sprinter. And now they started to say, okay, you know, what's happening here? Now, we know we need relative body strength, but according to Dr. William Kramer, who really is the godfather of strength research. He's written, I believe it's 14 books on strength training, 14 books, and has helped either produced or assisted in producing 500 research studies. I mean, so Dr. Bill Kramer, in my opinion, probably is the most well-versed. And ironically, I had a conversation with Dr. Kramer less than a month ago, and I asked him some pointed questions, and all the research he's done to optimize speed, it's 2 times body weight on the squat. End of story, 1.85 for women. So with that said, this kind of how strong is strong enough, it started to kind of get more clear where, hey, you got to get strong, but there is a ending to it, right? There is a way that, you need to be incredibly strong. Well, I also think that's based on the individual and the sport and a lot of other factors, but just talking from a macro standpoint, this 2 times body weight's important to remember, but going back to the force signature, it's different than the amateur sprinters. For world-class sprinters, the front half, it spikes a lot sooner. And here's my hypothesis on why. And I shared this with people, and this is not only my hypothesis, but this is blended with what the researchers have shared. And why is it different, and how do we get our athletes to have more of a foot strike in the ground like world-class sprinters? Because sprinting and speed and athleticism and jumping, the essence is, rate of force production into the ground, the amount of force and how fast we put force. That is the holy grail of performance in terms of speed and fielding court sports. So what is that? Why is that initial ground contact with world-class sprinters, the first half of that analysis of that ground contact, why is that different? Well, they spike a lot sooner, their initial, because they create a lot more stiffness. So how Dr. Ken Clark describes it, and he's actually become a personal friend. He's a PhD. He's a biomechanist. He did some research. He did the research at SMU in that 2014 study, and has his PhD and is a college professor. And his specialty is speed development, being a biomechanist. And what's interesting, why we have a special relationship with Dr. Ken Clark, believe it or not, I think he's like 37, 38 now. He was a Parisi Speed School athlete in high school as a high school running back. So, I mean, how cool is that, right?
Full circle.
Yep. He came from Connecticut, and he went through our program. And I think we sparked his interest in speed. Now he's doing some really world-renowned, groundbreaking research. So it's kind of cool to definitely, and I speak to Ken regularly. He's on our board of advisors if you look at our website and whatnot. So, I'm really excited about the science. But going back to answer your question, is that they strike the ground with a much stiffer lower leg. So it's really simple. It's like throwing a punch. If you throw a punch and you have a limp wrist or the fist isn't tight, the force into the bag or whatever, maybe the measurement device like Ivan Drago in Rocky IV, and he punched the bag.
I was waiting for a Rocky reference. Waiting for it.
And the Russian said, 1,400 pounds. Whatever he kills, he destroys.
I think these guys need to know. They need to know you have an appreciation and an affinity for the Rocky just series. Just the storyline of Rocky, guys.
I got Mike cracking up over there, so I can't see Karen, so I don't know if he's laughing or not. But so that phrase, that's the best. Whatever. So what does that mean? Well, whatever he kills, he destroys. Oh no, whatever he hits. I'm sorry, not kills. Whatever he hits, he destroys. That was it. So imagine, throwing a punch with a limp wrist. Like Ivan Drago is not going to, record 1,400 pounds, right? That thing's got to be stiff and it's got to hit it. Everything's got to be locked. So the same thing with the lower shank when that hits the ground. So their hypothesis, the researchers are that it's hitting the ground much, much stiffer. Now, what makes that stiff? Like, is it a stronger calf? And this is where the jury's out. And this is where I think I'm on cutting edge with the team here, because, having conversations with Ken, I gave him my theory, and he sat back in his chair and he's like, wow, that makes sense. Now he can't come out and say, hey, this is why, but I'm definitely onto something with these guys, and I'm gonna bring some people together around the world, the top researchers in fascia, because believe it or not, I sit on the board of directors of the Fascia Research Society, which are the top guys in the world. So I'm gonna close this loop here in the next couple, next year or two, in terms of doing some ultrasound studies. But when you talk about a stiff lower shank, first they know that they feel very strongly that's the reason. Common sense would tell you that, right? So when you throw a punch, you got to be stiff with the wrist and everything with the lower leg. But how do you do that? Well, it's an element of co-contraction, right? But also, I believe the fascia facilitates that co-contraction, and having a stronger fascia wrapping would also facilitate that. But I also don't think it stops at the lower shank, below the knee. I also think these guys have the ability to create incredible amounts of stiffness throughout the entire kinetic chain on ground contact, so they don't leak energy out of the core, out of the hip, out of anywhere else in the upper body. The shoulder girdle, like everything's kind of like, when a world-class sprint is kind of locked into place. Now, so what does that mean? And according to Stuart McGill, my theory on this, and I'm fairly bullish on this. I'm not a researcher, so I can go out and say this stuff. It's funny when you talk to researchers; they're very cautious. They're not going to put anything out there unless it's backed by.
They know what they're used to having to present and then defend everything they say. So they're like, whoa.
Yeah. So I can go out on the limb as a coach and share my theory and I think have a strong theory on this. So what makes world-class sprinters run really fast? And I'm going to throw in, by the way, this. Dan Path, who's also, has become a good friend, and I know Dan fairly well. I was crazy enough where I took my two sons out to go see him for 4 days, and we hung and I watched him do his thing to my kids so I can learn. Right, I had my guinea pigs, so they were 13 and I think 15 at the time, and so I'm crazy like that. Like I'm just gonna get on a plane and go and do stuff. And Dan has coached 300-meter sprinters that ran sub 10:00 that didn't lower body lift. Or if they did, it was very, very sparingly because they had, whether it be injury or issues. So something's going on here. Now, again, everybody's different. I'm not saying, you don't have to lift and you can run 10. No, I'm not saying that. They had reasons why they couldn't lift. But here's my theory. And it's built around this thing called mechanical composite. And I believe, and Stuart McGill will back this up. So this came from Stuart McGill. So I'm piecing together Peter Wayan, Ken Clark, Stuart McGill, Robert Schleip, all these different researchers that some of them, don't know each other's research. Like when I introduced Stuart McGill to Peter Wayan, I actually had them both on a conference call together, and I introduced them to one another. And I made them both familiar with each other's research, right? Because Stu is all about the back and the core. He's not, reviewing research on speed. And Peter Wayan is doing his research on speed development. He's not necessarily, looking at Stu's research. But I was looked at both researchers and putting it together. Here's my theory. Stuart has shown, and really through his research and dissections, that the body creates a mechanical composite to create stiffness. And that's when the fascia helps facilitate co-contraction to create unbelievable isometric stiffness in the body. And that's what we want when we sprint, the ability to have it be a strong spring. The human body is a spring. Every stride, the body's a spring. And you want to be a strong, tight spring, not a loose spring, like a 2020 Chevy pickup truck with extra leaf springs. It's really tight when you ride in the back. Anything in the back, if you go over railroad tracks, it's gonna, if it's not tied down, it's gonna jump out of the trunk, right, or the back of the truck. The body wants to have that tight suspension system, not like a 1970 Oldsmobile that has, the shocks are shot. It feels like you're in a boat. If you go over railroad tracks, you're like this. So that ability to create mechanical composite or co-contraction to create stiffness in a very short period of time, in milliseconds, is the key to ground reaction forces off the ground. And what's a mechanical composite? So if I had a piece of pine wood, like a 1/2 inch piece of pine, and you saw the grains were running vertical, and I held it like this. I held my hands like with the grains, and you punched it. And that's what a lot of white belts will punch if you're in a martial arts class and the 10-year-olds are breaking boards to go to the next level belt. They'll have a piece of wood. It'll be relatively thin, and the instructor will hold it, with the grain. So you can punch it and crack it in the grain. So it's easy to break. If I took that same piece of pine and I sliced it into like 1/8 veneer sheets, and then I took the same piece of sheets, the 6 sheets or so, and I cross-glued them together. I crisscrossed the grains and I glued them. That's called plywood. And if I held that same piece of wood up, that little kid probably wouldn't break that, probably break his hand before he breaks that same thickness board. That's a mechanical composite. So layers of our core, our muscles are all layers. They all lay on one another. Agonists, antagonists, they're all working simultaneously. And my theory is that the fascia, because it has 10 times more the proprioceptors than muscle, is facilitating along with the neuromuscular system. But the fascia is like that mechanical, that glue, if you will, is that the veneer cross gluing. Well, there's glue that holds it together that facilitates that stiffness at that. And the magic is doing it for milliseconds and then releasing it. That creates this unbelievable stiffness at ground contact. And when you look at lean athletes that might not be super strong that can run really fast, that is my theory based on the research. And the training that we do, the sprint drills, all the different skills that we do, the med balls, all these things are facilitating that mechanical composite to create stiffness, and also co-contraction, isometric contractions to allow the stored elastic energy, in the connective tissue system to do its thing and get real spring. So when you're running really fast and you're doing those types of things, the muscles work more isometrically. That's proven now. And the explosive dynamic force production is really more an elastic response. And they've shown that with kangaroos, doing studies with kangaroos with gas masks. They burn a lot more energy walking than they do hopping, a lot more energy expenditure, because that elastic energy in the connective tissue system is free energy. It's not calorie dependent. And that elastic energy is only able to be used if muscles are isometrically contracted and stiffened, so the tendons stretch, not the muscle. And that's really, when we do things really dynamically and explosively, it's a lot more connective tissue driven than anything else, not just with the tendons themselves, but with the fascia facilitating co-contractions and what have you. When you really look at the lower limb, the Achilles, a big tendon, lots of energy stored in the Achilles. Think about the semimembranosus, semitendinosus. Just think about those anatomical descriptions: membranosus, tendinosus, tendon driven. Those muscles are more tendon driven. They store more elastic energy. The glute is not tendon driven. The glute is more of a power muscle. So we have these muscles in our body. These, the gastroc is, part of the gastroc is the Achilles. It flows right into the gas. Tendon driven. So these tendon driven muscles that are really the muscles that catapult us, that really facilitate this dynamic speed. And they are trainable. Like they do get trained. They do get thicker with different training protocols and use. But I'm gonna pause there and come up for air for, let you guys come up for some air to kind of just stop there for questions or comments on that explanation.